Power up. Welcome to Energypreneurs, where I bring to you the exciting new opportunities in solar power, battery, and electric cars. I'm your host, Sohel Hasni. I have been tracking and analyzing these technologies on LinkedIn and Twitter for more than 10 years. Now we meet on podcast.
When you introduce an electric vehicle, replacing a traditional vehicle, you obviously save a lot of petrol being burned. And as a result, you also save a lot of carbon dioxide getting emitted into the air. These avoided emissions are a big thing, and that can also help sometimes financing projects. We discuss with Guillaume, his company, how they are specifically looking for electric vehicle project across Asia to bring those financing upfront so that those countries who have very difficult to reduce their emission commitment can buy in or pay to projects in developing countries where it could be done much cheaper. Because at the end of the day, if you save a ton of CO2 being released to the air, it's best to do where it is the cheapest way to do it. So please join in to find out a lot of details of how this carbon pricing works, how emissions are being paid for internationally, what obligations are there, and what are the new things that was added into the Paris Agreement. Please join me.
Hi, Guillaume. Finally, great to meet you.
Hello, so hi. Thanks for the opportunity.
I'm looking forward to a very exciting discussion on electric vehicle financing.
My name is Guillaume Rémy. I am a French national, but I've been living in the Netherlands for a good part of 11 or 12 years now. I have two hats on my head. The first hat is the hat of an advisor working on project finance for infrastructure projects around the world, especially in emerging markets. So that's transport, energy, mostly a bit of water and social infrastructure as well. And the other hat I have on my head is the hat of director and co-founder of a new exciting venture called Zeroca, and through which we develop carbon credit programs dedicated to electric mobility in emerging markets. And I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to discuss that in more details during the chat.
Wow. So you said you finance a range of infrastructure, right?
We advise either private developers working on concession agreements with governments or development agreements, or we advise government themselves, and it's mostly the latter in emerging markets. We do that often with the help of financing from the big international donors like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or so forth. And we provide what we call transaction advisory mandates. So we help a government structure a project legally, financially. We do the studies and we help them bring it to market to try and realize the best possible deal for them. After contract negotiation and signature with a private party.
So that gets done on a success fee basis, I guess?
It depends on the model. On the government side, it's mostly payment by milestone. On the private side, there's a bit more of a risk element to it, but it depends. Both are possible.
Wow, okay. So how large are your transactions?
Typically for transactions of those natures, you're talking minimum 20, 30 million, and it goes up to 1 billion and above, 2 billion maybe. Typically, a normal size transaction would be between 50 and 300. It really depends on what infrastructure you're talking about. Obviously, it can be, if you're in energy, it can be a solar plant of 20, 30 megawatts. That's relatively small scale. And you can be talking about a massive highway covering 500 kilometers, then you're in the billions.
But if it's ADB or World Bank finances, you still have to go through their procurement process. So you just take your client up to the board approval, right?
That's when we advise on the private side. We advise them on how to structure the financing. And then indeed, you have to talk to the banks. It can be a development bank or commercial bank. You have them get credit approval, structure the lending, etc. But like I said, we are mostly on the government side. And then it's the role of the other party, the private party, to structure the financing. We are here to negotiate the terms of the PPP, public-private partnership agreement or concession agreement or whatever agreement you have in place. So we hire to negotiate the best terms for government and make sure they get a good deal. In that case, the government is not the one raising the finance, so typically not the entire financing.
So you must be doing a lot of unsolicited, right? Because on the electric vehicles, especially, government haven't gotten their head around.
In electric mobility, most of the activities are public sector, but it depends very much on which segment you're talking about. Everything that is related to 2 and 3 wheelers in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, those are mostly startups, right? So it's just companies with an idea trying to develop a new ecosystem, if you like. For the type of bigger vehicles which are used by governments, such as municipal buses for urban transportation, for instance, those typically take the form of direct purchase by a government or a sort of long-term operations contract with a bus operator. So it's a wide range of possible structures that you can put in place. It really depends on which segment you're talking about. Obviously, you also have a lot of electric vehicles which can be used for logistics, for mining, for airports, ports. So all of those have different types of players being involved. I think that's one of the things that's exciting about the electric mobility sector. You get to deal with so many different players from different horizons, and it's an exciting place to work in.
I'm just curious if anyone doing a electric vehicle retrofit, especially in the mining and other key areas, because you have already the car retrofitting seems to be an easy solution, but I know a lot of people disagree.
Yeah, look at Zeroca. We don't have an official policy on this, but what we observe is that unless you're talking of a very big item, like very heavy machinery, like you said, for mining or something like that, so a piece of equipment which will last you 20, 30 years, then it might be worth considering retrofitting. Typically, if that's not the case, it is much cheaper and easier to just purchase a new vehicle. You just replace. Why? Because you have obviously issues of the chassis not being built the same way for internal combustion engines as for battery electric vehicles. You have issues about warranties. So the moment you start touching the engine, etc., you lose the warranty, and it's very difficult to get a warranty and adequate insurance on a retrofitted vehicle. In most categories of vehicles, replacement by a new vehicle is the obvious solution and the smarter choice. But this being said, exceptions might make sense sometimes.
Yeah, in the Philippines, I don't know the exact number. I'm sure it's in excess of 250,000 jeepneys are there. These are the second world jeeps converted. I think they are 18-seaters. So it's in a public transport across the country. I understand the government had financing made available for this conversion project. There are few brand new electric come in, but every time I look at one of the jeepneys, I said, yeah, maybe a smaller battery with a battery swap could work, because a lot of people claim this is a cultural icon in the Philippines. We really don't want to change. So I'm just wondering, someone must have approached you, or you must be involved, no?
Yeah, in the Philippines, we have started to prospect. We can get to that for a moment, but for Zeroca, so let me divide again between my two hats. As advisors, my company Rebo has done a lot of work in the Philippines, including in public transportation for metro, roads, and what have you. For Zeroca, it has up to date not been a core focus of ours, but we are starting to look at it now, and it's in our plan for the coming quarter. The reasons why we haven't done that have to do with the presence or not of bilateral agreements under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We can discuss that maybe later during the chat. As far as jeepneys and conversions are concerned, typically for larger vehicles, battery swap are not the most obvious choice because of the acceleration of the charging technology. So what the direction the market is taking, and again, this is just a personal opinion, but the direction the market is taking is that the batteries are getting smaller but more efficient, and the charging is much faster. So instead of having to get around with a massive battery of 200, 300, 400 kilowatt hour, you get around with smaller batteries and you do what we call opportunity charging at the end of your route, 5 minutes, and you top up 10, 20%, and that gets you through the day, right? So this is the direction the market is taking. Now, obviously, for much smaller vehicles like two-wheelers, which require much smaller capacity of battery and for which it's much easier to replace the battery even by hand, yes, we see a lot of battery swap system being used, especially in Asia, but we see the model being also developed in many emerging markets in Africa. So again, technology-wise, we're agnostic. I think both models can make sense, but yeah, it's really depend on the use of the vehicle and the type.
Yeah, because the jeepneys, just at the top of my head, I don't think it will need more than a 50 kilowatt hour battery if you have charging at the end. I agree that there's no point putting a 200 kilowatt hour battery saying, okay, it will give you a 400 range, because their average speed is 10, 12 kilometer, and they don't drive a lot during the day, mostly stops, and they wait for passengers. If you have a charging available, they can easily get topped up.
That's one of the difficulties with electric vehicles. You need to think exactly about how you're going to use it and to optimize your battery sizing with your charging capacity and charging strategy, whether you're up for slower overnight charging or fast charging during the day or ultra fast charging nowadays. So you need to think really carefully about how you're going to use your vehicle to make sure you don't oversize your charging equipment or your battery, and operate it as profitfully as possible.
Very good. So you are working on a lot of exciting stuff.
I believe so. Yeah. It's exciting. It's definitely an exciting space to be in. So on Zeroca, we are not technology experts. We are focusing on the financing and mostly on the opportunities offered by the carbon credit markets for electric mobility companies. What we do is we help electric mobility companies or operators of normal ICE fleets which want to venture into the world of e-mobility to secure carbon credits, and in this way finance a portion of the cost difference which sometimes still exists between the old-time vehicles and the newer electric vehicles. So this is a new opportunity which emerges because the carbon credits markets are under revival. And the most interesting segment is what we call the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And this is the new carbon credit markets 2.0, which allows the exchange of carbon credits between countries which are members of the Paris Agreement. And there is a big opportunity there. And this opportunity created by the Paris Agreement coming to fruition with the implementation rules being discussed currently for this new carbon credit markets. And on the other hand, the emergence of electric mobility in a host of emerging markets around the world. So the concomitance of those two factors makes it quite an interesting space to be in, and a space where there is a lot of opportunities which, to our knowledge, are not fully grasped by a lot of the players on the ground yet.
Yeah, for our listeners, will you please just explain the coupon zero you mentioned, right?
Let me summarize. You have three main types of carbon credit markets. So when we talk about carbon credits, we're actually talking of very different things. They all represent 1 ton of CO2 emissions that is avoided or cancelled, but they don't actually have the same value. They're not the same product, because those products exist by virtue of regulations and what you make of it. So you have three segments, main segments. The first one is what we call the compulsory markets. And this is typically your exchange trading system, cap and trade, like you have in the European Union, in the state of California, in Australia, and in almost 50 countries around the world now. They have similar systems. The value of those credits depends massively on what the local rules and regulations are, what the objectives and targets are, how stringent they are, and therefore you can get to values per ton which range from less than $1 to above $200 in some Western European markets. Next to that, over the last 10 years, you've seen a lot of activity in the voluntary markets. So this is a market whereby companies can offset the emissions produced by the activities on a voluntary basis. And this market is dominated at the moment mostly by nature-based solutions like forest preservation or replacement of cook stoves, for instance, the clean cooking. E-mobility in both of those markets are a very small niche, right? They represent less than 2 or 3% of the overall carbon credit market. So the value of those voluntary credits is typically much lower because it's purely on a voluntary basis, and there's nothing at the moment that mandates companies to actually purchase those. And you as an individual can purchase the credits as well. But you're talking average cost per ton last year was something like 7 or 8. And the range of prices varies between a few cents for the ones that have credibility issues or a lot of problems to maybe $40, $50. So that's the second market, which has dominated carbon credit markets internationally over the last 10 years. And the third category is international markets created by international treaties. So you had the Kyoto Protocol in the 1990s. As you probably know, this market is not dead, but it's being replaced by this new market created by the Paris Agreement. And the difference with the voluntary market is that the buyers are sovereign governments, And why do they buy those credits? They buy them because they can use those credits to meet their commitments that they have made to all the other members of the treaty for 2030 under the Paris Agreement. So instead of decarbonizing at home in Sweden or Singapore or Japan for $100 per ton, they can help a good project in an emerging market secure emission reductions for a cost ranging from $15 to $40, $50. So the advantage for the host country of the project is that it helps facilitate, well, in the case of electric mobility, it helps to facilitate the transition to EVs. And in the case of the buyer government, it helps them meet their commitment under the Paris Agreement at a cheaper cost than what they would be able to do at home. So it's a question of abating the CO2 emissions where it is cheaper to do so and where it's more cost efficient to do so to achieve ultimately a bigger overall reduction in emissions at the planet level. So this is just a short story, but it's important to understand the three categories because carbon markets are still a bit of a jungle out there, and it's important to understand that a credit is not necessarily equal to another. It really depends what you're talking about and the way you trade it, who is the buyer.
Yeah, especially the third market, because the first market that you mentioned, it's already the protocols are well established, and the second one is between consenting parties. They can agree on whatever they want. It's quite loose, I would say, because
they are standard.
Yeah.
So typically buyers will want to see the program or the project or the activity being registered according to a certain standard. But indeed, there's nothing that prevents the party from buying whatever.
Subjectivity involved as well, right?
Yeah, you have always questions about how the baseline was calculated, what is the level of scrutiny, how is the monitoring being done. So there has been a lot of scandals recently about the veracity of some of those credits.
And then the third market where a sovereign government under Paris Agreement will take and use that because that seems to be cheaper than forcing national industries to meet the target. That's new, but that will also have a lot of protocol involved, right?
Correct. If I go into little bit into the details, you have two specific clauses in the Paris Agreement that relate to that. The first one is the clause 6.2, which relates to bilateral agreements between two countries. So two members of the Paris Agreement are allowed to enter into a bilateral treaty, according to which the one party will sell carbon credits to the other. What needs to happen is an adjustment of the national registry for carbon of both entities to make sure that once you collate the two at international level, you don't have double counting. So typically the buyer country can deduct the carbon credit it's achieved from its own carbon registry, and the host country of the activity needs to increase its objective. But when you're talking of governance in emerging markets, sometimes the objectives are a bit lower and they're easier to attain. And therefore, there is a little bit of room here, if you do it cleverly as a government of those emerging markets, to sell some of those emission reductions to third parties and accelerate your transition to clean energy, clean cooking, clean transportation, or what have you.
That's actually very interesting because some of the countries in Central Asia where they still haven't gotten their thinking through because it's like a highly gas dependent power sector or coal dependent power sector, but they have a huge potential in terms of mitigation, energy efficiency and everything like. But if you suddenly bring in saying it's not an obligation per se, it's an opportunity for you to sell the credit, and because you can do way more than what you thought could be done, right?
Every government that is a member of the Paris Agreement has to send what they call a nationally determined contribution. So there is a mandatory part, a non-conditional part. So this is the types of activities that the government will do no matter what. And there is an unconditional portion, which is the list of all the activities that the government would undertake if it gets support in the form of climate financing or carbon credits to undertake those activities. So typically, carbon credits are a way to entice the governments to go beyond the unconditional commitments and move into what they would do conditionally if they get the right support. So if you tie it back to the world of electric mobility, which is the main topic of today, this is an opportunity for everybody who owns a fleet of standard vehicles, and they can be scooters, three-wheelers, taxis, minivans, buses, what have you. to switch to electric mobility and electric vehicles and finance a portion of the additional cost by the way of selling carbon credits. So it helps you bridge the gap in total cost of ownership, if you like. It's a contribution towards that. Behind the whole system is that you're motivated and incentivized to make the switch earlier than you would if you were not getting that support.
Yes. I think the Zeroca world that you have established has a lot of work to do.
We do. I can't tell you how many calls we're having with a bunch of players around the world who are thinking about electric, because this is a reality that's going to come to everybody. If you do it, if you want to be a front runner, etc., you are aware that typically you'll be getting the bruises of the risk and the additional cost, etc. Some people want to still be the front runners because it makes sense for them from a business perspective and to position themselves towards their customers. This is a way to help you through that transition and to absorb some of the additional costs you'll have as a front runner.
Yes, and a front runner means also you have the opportunity to set some of the rules of the game as well, because the rules of the game are yet to be developed, right?
Yeah, and it's a very competitive environment. I think if you talk to any operator involved in logistics everywhere around the world, by now everybody realizes that the future is to convert their fleet to electric. The question is, when do you do it? Typically in most countries, depending on the electricity price and how much you use your vehicle, how much you drive per day, etc., it's still a bit of a difficult decision to make. But a lot of startups are entering into this space because they also see that their customers at the other end, they want a clean logistics and delivery service system from A to B, green all the way. And some companies in the Western world, for instance, are willing to pay more for services which are green, from bringing goods all the way from whichever factory in Germany to their customers in Thailand, for instance. So you as a Thailand logistics operator are thinking, hey, if I want to capture that market, and please, my manufacturers, my client in Germany who wants to export its goods and make sure that the entire supply chain is green, I need to start thinking about how to do the last mile also in a green fashion.
Yeah, because we are not very far from a world where you will have some sort of carbon labeling on your product, right? Like a calorie labeling,
yes.
right? That will come.
Increasingly, companies have to report. So in European Union, we have a new regulation that was implemented earlier this year that mandates every company a certain size to start reporting on their carbon footprint. And that goes beyond what they're doing at home. It also goes towards trying to establish how much carbon is created by their products downstream and upstream, right? So
upstream
then you start
well.
looking upstream as well. So you need to start looking at your entire supply chain, how your product is being used at the end of the day, but also what are processes and what is the carbon footprint of all the processes, manufacturing and transportation that you use to produce your goods. So it forces you to think. At the moment, there's no objective in most sectors that are set yet, but everybody knows this is coming. So if you don't want to be caught by surprise, most large companies are starting to invest seriously into how can I improve my supply chain, and transportation and logistics is one aspect of that.
Yes, absolutely. I actually interviewed someone from the logistics industry in the Philippines last month, and this was an issue. She said, we haven't done anything yet, but the clients have started asking and we have started thinking. So of
Correct.
course, where you are, maybe that the same thinking is a bit more advanced than what's happening in emerging economies.
It's going extremely quickly. You have some markets where, the sales of electric vehicles were only 2 or 3 years back, there were 0.X% of sales were electric. And we're already at 10-15%, and in a few years we'll be at 50% plus. So once the curve starts taking off and people realize, actually, this is a viable technology, it fits my business, and maybe sometimes I can even save money if the electricity price are favorable. I don't need to import petrol. Governments are happy because it's less outflow of foreign currencies. They don't need to import fuel, which is typically one of the largest outflows of foreign currency. So it can really be a win-win in many markets. If you look at what Ethiopia is doing, for instance, they've simply banned the import of internal combustion engine vehicles, meaning every new vehicle that's entering the country is supposed to be electric. So they do that not because they absolutely want to be the front runner, but also because they see that from a macroeconomic point of view, they can replace the import of fuels from the Gulf and other markets and all the outflows of dollars that goes with that by locally produced electricity, which is 100% green from hydro.
Yeah, it's ultimately, I know a lot of people get offended when I say that. Ultimately, electric vehicle versus gasoline vehicle, the ICE, the internal combustion engine car, will be almost like a smoking because it is hazardous to a nation's health, especially if you don't have indigenous energy sources. You have to import fuel, right? So
Correct.
and it's impact everyone else. So if there is a solution that you can use your own hydropower, your own rooftop solar to run, then those who wants to import and would cause a liability to national economic health, like smokers do to the national health, it becomes a societal issue, right? It becomes everybody's business. So that's what
the climate benefits.
Yeah.
You have the climate benefits, which are worldwide, reduction of carbon emissions, but you're right. You have the safety and the health benefits, which is that you don't have particulate matter emissions. So for a city, it's quite interesting to switch to EVs, at least for the vehicles that pollute the most, which are the largest ones, so buses, etc. If you want to do something about pollution in your city, that's obviously a great angle to look at. So on many levels, it makes sense. The question is, at the moment, in 90% of the cases, this is still not fully financially attractive. So the question becomes, how do you motivate private players to take the jump and actually change the vehicles that they operate? So that becomes a question of money. And that's where carbon credits are a portion of the answer.
So typically, what proportion of the cost can be recovered, just a ballpark number, by selling the carbon credit in advance if you're able to sell?
Yeah. So first, I should specify carbon credits are not financing instruments as such. So you only get the revenues once you have produced the emission reduction. So what happens is on an annual basis, you demonstrate how many kilometers you have driven, how many liters of fuel you have avoided if you have driven those kilometers compared to if you have driven those kilometers with an ICE vehicle. And the difference between the two is your amount of carbon credits, which you can issue, sell, and then you get revenue. You have ways to pre-finance it. If you summarize it and look at the overall life of the vehicle, let me take a bus, for instance. If you take 10 years of carbon credits and you manage to secure a good contract now for, say, on a net basis, $30 per ton, the amount of revenues you can get is probably 5 to 10% of the initial capex. So it is not at all insignificant, and it can cover, typically a good portion of the additional cost of EVs, which is still present. Of course, it depends a lot on how much you use your vehicle. Obviously, the more you drive, the more interesting it is to switch to EV because the cost of electricity and the cost of maintenance per kilometer are typically lower for EVs compared to ICE. And it also depends on where you operate those vehicles because you're not going to generate as many emission reductions if you operate the same vehicle in a country, shall I say, Nigeria or South Africa, which have a grid which are not very clean and runs mostly on fossil fuels, compared to a country like Nepal, Laos, Ethiopia, countries which have a grid which is very green. Because when you calculate the amount of emission reductions, you have to take into account the grid factor of the national grid and where your electricity comes from.
Yeah, these grid emission factors coming into this calculation, of course, because credit is an avoided credit, not a real credit, right? So if your grid is polluting, then you can avoid. But if you're already green, then it does.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you charge your vehicles from a grid which is pretty dirty by nature, then obviously the saving would be much lower. But what is emerging in a lot of markets is the grid itself is not very green, but you have a lot of off-grid solutions which are emerging and are getting gradually very cheap. So think about obviously rooftop solar or even small wind. If you have, I don't know, logistic parks and you have a lot of rooftop available and you can install solar on it and charge your electric vehicles from that, then you don't need to use the grid factor of the grid for those kilowatt hour which you have charged from your own energy sources. So that's a way to combine. That's where the world of transportation and energy starts being one and the same, actually. And that's also one of the exciting things about this market at the moment. They used to be, to some extent, separate worlds, but at the moment, if you look at the future, it's just one and the same question.
Yeah, but if you are irrespective of your grid emission factors, converting from an internal combustion engine car to electric vehicle will provide you savings because you are not generating the unnecessary heat in your car. Of course, it gets generated in the power station, but those cooling systems are way more efficient than your car's cooling system. And then eventually, as you said, you can move into solar, right?
Yeah, it's not about the cooling system as much as it is about the emissions of greenhouse gases. So indeed, yeah, it's about where you source your electricity from. If you power your electric car with a dirty grid, then you have much less impact than if you power it from renewable energy.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I'm saying, but still, just switching will have effect. Even if your power is generated by 100% coal, still it will be, because the conversion efficiency of a power plant is way more than conversion efficiency of a car.
Absolutely. No,
and an electric car, when you're sitting on a traffic jam, nothing runs. So there is a huge saving because you don't have any idling. So people should not get discouraged by saying, oh, no, if we have a hydro, we should not switch, no?
No, you're absolutely right. There is always a saving, but because the saving is the difference between two numbers, if you increase the second number by 10%, and you were already making 10% saving, then you actually double your saving. So it's very important. What I mean is that it can make a massive difference at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I think that's where your 5 to 10% comes in, right? You have a range.
Yeah, either way, yeah.
What else you do for fun? You look like you are very interesting, fully immersed into electric vehicles. So Guillaume, when you have free time, what else do you do?
My free time, apart from developing the business, I do sports. I walk around in the city and in the area where I live, which is the Netherlands. Quite pleasant, and I guess like everybody, I hang out with friends and other things. So and I have kids. That takes a lot of free time as well, I must say.
How large is your team in the transactional advisory business?
Oh, at Rebel we're about 300 now, so it's quite a large firm within the niche of public-private partnership and transaction advisory. A lot of my colleagues are focused on the Benelux market, which is still our home market, but the teams working internationally are probably, I'd say, 70 to 100.
And then you said you cover everything, not electric vehicle.
With that, we cover the full range of public sectors for infrastructure and pretty much every geography you can think of. Some markets are easier than others, but we're present across Asia, Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and obviously Europe and North America as well.
The way you are explaining that the government looking for funding will come to you and will help them. But as you are working with many government, you must have, like walking into a government of Nepal, you can say, hey, we did in Bhutan or Laos, they also have hydro, you have hydro, you should do this. You must do those cross-pollination, no? Easily.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. So that's the experience that you bring after having done several transactions in the same sector, in the same region. Obviously, you enrich your experience and the advice you give with whatever experiences you've had in the past. But I think that's pretty standard for any consulting business. That's the value that you get. Oftentimes, most of the time, at least on the government side, almost everything is procured. So the advice we give, it's because we've been selected after a competitive procurement process. So obviously the client will look at the experience that you have, the people that you bring, and select you on that basis.
Amazing. And on the carbon business, how large is your team?
So this is a much smaller venture. So this is Zeroca is a joint venture between Rebel, which is the consulting firm that I just presented, and another firm called The Consulting. And the joint venture between the two is basically the two firms putting some resources together and to develop this business. At the moment, actively working on Zeroca are 6 people. 6 people. So it's still a startup, it's still small. You have to realize in the world of carbon credits, electric mobility is a very small niche. But within that niche, I dare say we have the longest track record and the longest experience if you look at the experience of the partner with whom we have set that up with. The other co-founder of Zeroca has been doing this basically since the 90s. So since the Kyoto Protocol, he registered the first carbon credit program for electric mobility. And he's done probably more than half of the transportation project that has ever managed to receive carbon credits projects around the world. And that includes metro and train and electric buses and what have you.
Yeah, so once you have the system in place, of course, it is much easier. And then, of course, these are all knowledge-based products, no?
Absolutely. Yeah, the difficulty with those types of programs, there are not a lot of people who can successfully structure a carbon credit program for transportation because it is such a small niche. And it is not easy. You have to jump through a lot of hoops before you get your program approved. You need to devise your methodology according to a certain pre-approved standards. Sometimes you need to update the methodology itself, which takes another 1 or 2 years. You need to hire a verifying entity, which will come and verify that whatever program you're proposing is in line with one of the pre-agreed methodologies. You need to hire an auditor that will come and verify that whatever you put in the monitoring reports every year corresponds to reality. So there's a lot of administrative hoops that you need to jump through. And that makes sense because you need to be able to demonstrate that your activity that you're proposing, in fact, has an effect on the planet and CO2 emission savings. So those steps are heavy, but they are good because they enhance the credibility of the program and therefore the value of the carbon credits that are produced by the program.
I learned a lot of things, and I'm sure it has been very valuable for our listeners. We already have done quite a bit of time. Is there anything specific you wanted to highlight that I did not ask?
Yeah, I guess the question is, it's a matter of doing it now. And the reason why I was so pleased that you invited me is that what we're doing at the moment with Zeroca is a lot of awareness raising, really. Mm-hmm. Many people thinking about converting their fleet to electric or converting some of their activities to electric transportation. They don't even know that exists. And it's like a resource here, a pool of potential financing, a potential help. If you work with us or maybe with some other firms, most of the time you won't have to disburse a single cent. We'll do the work for you or they'll do the work for you. And it's basically a matter of registering to a program, subscribing to the program, and then tracking your mileage year after year. So in terms of administration, to get the program approved, it's a lot of work. But as a participant in the program, if you're guided by a professional firm, you don't have so much time and effort to put in and absolutely no money. So then the only question, and I think to answer your question, what I'd like to raise is there is time opportunity. There is a bracket now of opportunity which is available, but it's going to close. And the reason why it's going to close is because one of the main principles of carbon credits is that you need to demonstrate the additionality of your activity. If all the vehicles in the country are already electric, rolling out another electric vehicle is not additional, it's just business as usual. So the way it's defined in those carbon credit methodologies for transport is as soon as a particular category of vehicle is above 5% of sales for electric, for instance, then that particular category of vehicles is not considered additional anymore, and you cannot secure carbon credits from them. So when you look at how fast the adoption goes, you have to come in quite quickly and make sure you register to one of those programs before those thresholds are passed. Otherwise, you basically cannot claim carbon credits at all. And this would be a missed opportunity. So it's a matter of, if you want to be a front runner, it's all very good, but don't think about carbon credits once you have all the operations up and running, because you might be too late and lose on that opportunity.
Is the baseline getting shifted, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. As soon as you're business as usual, then basically you can't claim any carbon credits.
Interesting. I never thought that through. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And I didn't talk a lot about chargers, but this is absolutely relevant for charge point operators. So a lot of the participants in our program are people rolling out charge point services across a city or a country.
How can people find you, or where can people find you?
They can find us on our website, zeroca.world, or on LinkedIn. If you tag my name, you find my name, Guillaume Rémy, or any of you'll find about our activities. But I guess the easiest entry point is the website. And we have included a very handy little calculator in it, which allows you to estimate what would be your potential emission reductions and potential revenues from carbon credits for a range of vehicles, ranging from port and logistics vehicles to buses and vans and what have you. So that's a good starting point to estimate, hey, is this worth me looking at it or not? Typically, as soon as you're talking about vehicles in the hundreds or motorbikes in the thousands, then this is definitely worth looking at.
Absolutely. Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I'm sure my listeners will as well after listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shahai. That was great.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.